culture over everything, y'all. We taking it back. Black.
Welcome to Left to Black. I'm your host, Mark Anthony Neal, and we are joined by one of our friends of the show, Professor David H. Ikard, professor in the Department of English at the University of Miami, the author of several books, including Nation of Cowards, Black Activism in Barack Obama's Post-Racial America, and the just published Blinded by the Whites, Why Race Still Matters in the 21st Century America, both published by Indiana University Press. How are you doing today, David?
I'm doing excellent. Thanks for having me.
Of David Ikard's new work, William Jelani Cobb says Ikard is among our sharpest and most exciting thinkers on race, culture, and politics. So tell us a little bit about this new book, Blinded by the Whites.
Well, first of all, much love to Jelani, who, you know, when he said that, when I saw the blurb, I was just so impressed, because Jelani's a serious scholar, a great writer, and just a good person.
I mean, Jelani's a beast. I mean, that's
right.
Yeah.
So there's certain people that give you compliments that you know come from a real place and whose work that you deeply respect. And Jelani is certainly one of those. So I take that compliment in high regard. Blinded by the Whites was kind of motivated both by kind of a lot of personal political dynamics going on in my life. One of those dynamics was raising my children. I have an 8-year-old daughter and an 11-year-old son, both of who keep me kind of focused in on how race is being experienced, class and gender and sexuality is being experienced by Black youth, right? And so the ways in which, you know, my kids come home and they engage their identity, whether we're talking about my daughter, I have a chapter on Black beauty and thinking about how that informs how young Black girls kind of work through their, you know, their agency as girls, as women, as intellectuals. There's a chapter on my son and Black masculinity, and thinking through questions of how he's negotiating that on the playground, how he's negotiating that through music, so on and so forth. And then, you know, there's some even more personal stuff about, you know, my family and my family dynamic, which we've talked a great deal about for some time, and really getting into the minutia of how the certain kind of sexual politics, exploitive dynamics, patriarchal dynamics within my own family have informed how I think of myself as a scholar, activist.
You know, you opened the book, because one of the things that's, you know, both refreshing about the book and I think important is the fact that you've gone towards more of this kind of personal spin in terms of trying to link very personal issues to these larger racial politics and political issues. You begin the book talking about your late nephew, Tyrell Johnson. And it's a heartfelt tribute to him. Talk about how your relationship with him and then his subsequent death really impacted what you wanted to do with this book.
Well, I mean, Tyrell was just this brilliant, smart, beautiful young boy. And he had just come up for the summer. He was 15 years old. He was thinking about college. He's come from a very kind of a trying background in terms of having to deal with parents who have substance abuse problems. You know, he's also biracial, so he had some elements of trying to kind of negotiate that racial divide. And yet he just, you know, he was just a beautiful, smart, driven kid who my own son looked up to. And so I hadn't been able to spend any substantial time with Tyrell for the last couple of years. So when he came down last summer, and he was down for over a week, and we went to the gym, shot basketball, we went to the beach, we had a lot of one-on-one conversations about his life and what he wanted to do, and it was just so, you know, he was becoming a man, and he was excited about his uncle being a professor, and he didn't realize that in every one of my books, I had actually included a tribute to him. And so he was shocked to actually see that his name was in print. And I had told him that Blinded by the Whites was coming out and that I had mentioned him in Blinded by the Whites. And he had said, well, when it's published, could you give me a copy? And I was like, absolutely, I'll give you a copy. And so it pained me to see this young boy's life snuffed out. He got killed in a car accident right after school on the first day of school. The driver of the car was also killed, and it was an unspeakable tragedy.
One of the things, you know, that you do in the book, David, and you know, and it speaks to where we are, right? Because there are folks who will look at this book, look at the title, and like the complaints about so-called slave movies, you know, they would say, you know, it's 2014, right? Why are we reading another book about race, right? Why are we reading another book about why race matters? Wow. But, you know, when you talk about that turn to the personal, and it was hard, you know, particularly the opening sections of the chapter about your daughter, yes, not to laugh out loud, right? And you know, we both have daughters, so we've been here, right? So what do you do with the little black girl who decides that she wants to dress up as Goldilocks? Yeah. You know, how do you, on the one hand, you know, you want to say it's beautiful that my daughter has such a broad view of the world that she believes that she can be anybody that she wants. Right. But this is Goldilocks, right? And then being lectured by the teacher, you know, who's raising questions to you. I mean, talk a little bit seriously about this parenting and race issue, particularly when it comes to black girls. I mean, you're a single dad, so you're dealing with those dynamics also. You know, you're doing her hair. I mean, talk about those kind of dynamics.
Right. Well, you know, it's funny about that particular chapter because that's the chapter that seems to be the one that is resonating the most. With readers, I've time and time again, people are coming and say, "Oh, I've read this chapter, and now I'm sharing this particular chapter with all of my friends and colleagues, and people are now asking me to come and give talks, and they're particularly interested in that chapter." The funny thing about that chapter is that it wasn't initially part of the book. It happened. This incident happened about. When I was finishing up what I thought would be the last chapter, and I was so frustrated by it and stunned by it that I said, I have to write about this. Yeah. I tell people all the time that I write angry and they don't believe me, but in truth, that's what motivates me a lot of times. And what was striking about this particular moment for me was that my daughter had become, when she turned about 4 years old, she became very extremely color conscious, right? So she would say, you know, Mom is light skinned and you're darker skinned and I'm lighter skinned and my brother's a little kind of in between. And I kept saying to her, look, Octavia, we're all black, right? We're black, right? And she seemed to become increasingly more infatuated with the white girl's hair and skin tone. Right. And I would, of course, I'm educating her and reading her all these books of colors and books about girls of color, for example. We didn't do the whole Barbie doll kinds of things. And so I thought, okay, she's just going through a phase. We're having this conversation, so she'll be fine. I mean, her mother is a black feminist, has always been a black feminist political thinker. Her aunt is a black feminist professor, woman, runs the women's studies department at Indiana University. So he's had aunts and her mother and his father. So I thought Octavia would be fine. And then there's this incident where she's asked to dress up as her favorite character and she wants to be Goldilocks. And that was kind of a final straw for me. And I really wanted to kind of communicate in that chapter how vigilant we have to be in order to, because our focus tends to be on black boys and educating black boys and protecting black boys. And oftentimes black girls are just kind of this afterthought when in fact they're undergoing just as much, if not even more, kind of assaults in terms of their image than black boys. And the focus on beauty is important because unlike black men, beauty is not at the center of how society will evaluate and judge us. So people say, why are you focused on beauty? Because for women, it's more politically, politically informative in terms of how they move through the world. That's not something they can just pass off.
You're watching Left to Black. I'm your host, Mark Anthony Neal. We're joined today by Professor David H. Ikard, who is a professor of English at the University of Miami, the author of the new book, Blinded by the Whites, Why Race Still Matters in 21st Century America, just published by the University or Indiana University Press. Let me shift gears a little bit, David, in terms of thinking about some stuff that's happening contemporarily. We've watched in recent weeks the conversation, the issues around racial discourse surrounding Melissa HarrisPerry. And particularly a particular segment in which she's there with a bunch of comedians who are talking about race in humorous ways. And of course they make a reference to former Governor Mitt Romney and his black grandchild. And it's funny, I was talking to Marcelina Morgan about this, and Professor Morgan makes this point that one of the things that white America white America obviously doesn't understand black culture, right? And so when she sees this particular one, Melissa HarrisPerry, which is so obvious, right? Anyone who's going to see this picture is going to have the same reaction, right? There was nothing, politically significant or culturally significant in pointing out there's a black kid amongst a sea of 30-something white folks, right? What kind of experience is this kid going to have? Right. And Professor Morgan goes, what Melissa was doing was a form of signifying. Right, and white America doesn't necessarily get that. The way that white supremacy functions, and again, this is Professor Morgan again, is to deny the obvious. Yes. And so we're looking at this woman now on, a thoughtful, significant contributor to public discourse around race, femininity, gender, class, a whole range of things, who's forced to apologize for acknowledging the obvious. Yes. What does that say about, one, the kind of precarious situation that it is to be an African-American thinker in the public realm like that? And does gender have anything to do with how the larger culture chose to really beat up on Melissa HarrisPerry for saying what she did?
Yeah, Mark, when you come, I have to start writing stuff down because I'm like, so much stuff. I need to take notes to make sure I cover the ground that I'm supposed to cover. But, absolutely. And let me say this about Melissa HarrisPerry. I don't always agree with her critical perspective. But there was this conversation on Twitter about, somebody making fun. It's like, oh, somebody's called Melissa HarrisPerry, this kind of leading scholar, and da-da-da-da. Let's be very clear. Melissa HarrisPerry is a scholar. Right. She is a scholar of the first order, right? She didn't start out, she didn't get her degree at Walmart, right? This is a scholar who has been doing it at the highest level for a sustained amount of time.
I always think about this joke that Mark Eric Dyson called, when folks start coming at him, he's like, look, I'm an endowed university professor, right? I didn't get my degree from American Idol.
Right. The fact that Melissa HarrisPerry can go from the Ivy Leagues and be this kind of down sister and be able to then translate that into this form where she can reach a whole different audience is in fact brilliant. And for those of us, this is always why I'm always backing away from, too harsh a critiques about people like Tyler Perry and folks like that, because I think it's really easy to throw darts at folks and not really appreciate what it actually takes to make a Hollywood movie, what it actually takes to do some of these kinds of things. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't be critical, but it does mean we need to acknowledge the labor, and we need to, come and check folks when they start attacking folks like Melissa HarrisPerry as not being a real scholar. Obviously, they know nothing about her. If you're making that kind of argument, you haven't looked at the Vita. Right. You haven't looked at, her accomplishments. So I think that's important to the issue of gender, right? Because I think, people have come after Michael Eric Dyson. They have come after Cornel West, but not in this kind of vicious way. Right. Right. I think there's another level of vitriol here. Yeah. Right. That is a kind of an undercurrent, like, she's this uppity, pretty, pseudo-intellectual who's saying this off-the-cuff stuff. And I think there is certainly some gender critique. In fact, I would even go so far as to say even many black male scholars prominent black male scholars have taken shots at Melissa Harris.
As if she had to be knocked down a peg, right? I mean, that's right.
Right. If we're going to be truthful, truthful about her trajectory, you know, she's taken some shots intra-racially as well. And to your point about you know, speaking to these issues of race, I mean, there's that wonderful moment in Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man where the protagonist is giving that speech in front of all these prominent white men. Instead of saying, you know, personal responsibility, he says social equality, and they shut down and they say, what you say there, boy? Repeat that. What you said about that? You know, equality. And it was a great moment in that novel because it demonstrated how that white male power structure controlled the language of racial representation, and particularly when it came to racial inequality. And I think what has happened in this so-called post-racial environment that we live in today, that discourse is very much at play, so that language of being able to signify, like you're talking about, to being able to engage race in this kind of honest, raw way has been hijacked, so that when people of color actually speak to the ways in which they've been like subjugated in this radically racist environment, we get pegged paradoxically as the racist. So if we see race, somehow we're now the racist. And in fact, there is nobody that I grew up with who would have ever invited me over for Thanksgiving dinner and not told their white parents that I was black.
Right, because it was the obvious thing.
It would be a problem if I'm knocking on the door for Thanksgiving. They look around. In fact,
they're not expecting you.
I had a friend who did just that. And said, you know, I'm gonna be honest with you, David, I didn't realize it was gonna be such a big problem, but my grandparents, I had a heart attack. Like, what you doing messing with our Thanksgiving? Like, he's all right stuff, but he's black.
Let's talk about in this context of Melissa, Professor HarrisPerry, you know, the culpability of the company that employs her, MSNBC, in this conversation, right? Yes. You know, what kind of responsibility do they have to back her, to support her? I would fundamentally argue to have even ignored the charges in the first place. Yeah, again, this is coming right on the heels of the Martin Bashir situation. And let's be honest, however you might feel about Sarah Palin, if you're Martin Bashir, you can't be on national television talking about defecating in somebody's mouth. I mean, that's just, that crosses politically or otherwise, that crosses a kind of line, right? And so you understand how an MSNBC responds in that way. We listen to shock jocks on radio every morning, you know, take all kinds of shots at folks, and folks are never feel pressured to apologize in that context. What does it say about how an MSNBC might think about a Melissa HarrisPerry or folks like her, you know, that their initial response was, this ain't even an issue, just do what you do? Yeah,
that's again, excellent points. And I think it was either Dream Hampton or Brittany Cooper who made the very sage point that these segments don't just, you know, it's not like Melissa HarrisPerry is just saying, well, I'm going to do this. All this stuff is vetted. Right. All of this stuff is scripted. So there's very little that's not kind of anticipated. There's very little that does not, you know, go through the censoring dynamic. And let's also keep in mind that race sells. Racial conflict sells. And so I don't think these networks have any problem. I mean, look at Fox News. I don't think any of these networks have any problem raising the issue of race because it gets a lot of airplay. I mean, you know, Brittany Cooper's Salon.com op-ed pieces are some of the most viewed of all on Salon.com. And that's my girl, and she hits hard, right? But people are tuned in because race still matters in dramatic ways. So I think you're absolutely right. I don't think you can compare what she said with what this other guy said, and particularly what Baldwin made those homophobic comments. These are not comparable dynamics, and it actually, quite frankly, pained me because I think Melissa HarrisPerry is a real person. I think she means well, and I think when she talks, she comes from a real place. And to see her apologize, and she's apologized profusely multiple times, but her on the air apology, which was heartbreaking to see, and then the ways in which Fox News and other kinds of networks kind of picked it up and then poked fun at her, I just felt was disheartening. I really did. And I feel MSNBC dropped the ball here. I think you're absolutely right about that.
And I know there have been a lot of questions about whether or not folks thought her apology was disingenuous, right? But you have to give her credit on the fact that she apologized for what happened on her show on air, as opposed to apologizing for having to apologize, right, which is normally what we get. Right?
But when that happened, you knew there was never going to be any kind of full acknowledgement of that apology. Now, to Mitt Romney's credit, and I will give him some credit, he accepted the apology without qualification and moved on. But of course, the damage had already been done. He could be magnanimous in this way because, of course, the media was going to do what the media was going to do, and they were going to have a field day with this. And I think the other thing we have to keep in mind about Melissa Harris Perry's show, too, is Melissa Harris Perry is very hard-hitting when it comes to interrogating, critiquing kind of this conservative political discourse. And so she also had a bullseye on her head. And so this became an opportunity to take her down a peg, and there certainly were efforts to push her off the show. And I'm sure she was attuned to that. So I think bound up in that apology, was a genuine, sincere impulse, but also an awareness that even as she, and she's made this point before, that every time she goes on the show, she understands intuitively that could be her last show. Right. That the kinds of things that she's saying are not the kinds of things that people are typically get away with saying on television, and that she serves in some ways at the pleasure of MSNBC and their tolerance for this politically. And so she's always teetering on the edge anyway. That possibility. You're watching Left of Black. We're joined today by Professor David H. Ikard, who is a professor of English at the University of Miami, authored the new book, Blinded by the Whites, Why Race Still Matters in 21st Century America, published by Indiana University Press. The whole situation with Professor Harris Perry, of course, also raised another conversation about who black public intellectuals are and what the role of black public intellectuals are. I said to you, because I was fortunate to be able to also blurb Blinded by the Whites, and I've said this to you personally. I mean, one of the things that I find that's very important about this book, particularly in terms of the way that you move to the personal, is that it really does mark your entry into this arena of doing this kind of very serious public intellectual work, right? What very often drives this now is not the analysis, right? But to be able to connect that analysis to the kind of personal things that everyone experiences on some sort of level. As you look at the landscape now, what does it really mean to be a black public intellectual? When we think about the generation that came before us, the Dysons, the Manning Marivals, the Bell Hooks, the Patricia Williams, the late June Jordan, where being a public intellectual meant that you were writing for a public. What does it mean now when you have a Mark Lamont Hill at HuffPost Live, or Melissa Harris Perry at MSNBC, a Michael Eric Dyson or a Joy Reid, at MSNBC, folks, you mentioned Brittany Cooper, who is writing for a public, but part of that is also her presence on a Twitter or Facebook. You have folks who've never written books but are these important, contributors to public discourse because they have blogs. What does it mean to be a black public intellectual in this context in 2014? Again, another excellent question. And again, you've read drafts of that book before I published it. And I remember you had told me at one particular time, you say, if the public doesn't know who you are now, they will after this book. And I took that as another, when it comes to people's perspectives that I hold in high regard. Yours is certainly one. Jelani, Tracy Sharpley Whiting, Vijay Prashad, who also blurbed the second book. I mean, I'm sometimes overwhelmed by that. To the question of black intellectualism, I think it's both an exciting time and a trying time, right? On the one hand, everybody wants to be a black public intellectual, right? Everybody wants to have their own MSNBC show. Everybody wants to skip over all of the work that the Mark Anthony Neal, the Michael Eric Dysons have done, the Cornel West, the Melissa Harris Perry, all of that legwork, all of that getting tenure, establishing themselves in the academy, all of that before we get to this space where we can be multilingual, where we can reach a broader audiences, they want to skip all of the labor and jump right into the fame. And I think that fame-driven aspect of that public intellectualism is a problem. I think MSNBC had articulated something to that effect on Facebook a couple of days ago, and I think she was right on point with that, is that the end goal is not to have TV time and fame. The end goal is to actually speak truth to power and actually be able to translate, right? Be able to translate in this kind of Gramsci-esque way. The things that we're engaged with as intellectuals in an academic environment to the very folks on the ground who would benefit in a very material, political, and economic way from the knowledge that we have acquired, and siphoning off, as one of our colleagues has talked about, siphoning off some of those resources for those people on the ground is very important. Now the challenge too, and I think Joan Morgan had made a point about this on Facebook to say, look, I can't engage every pop cultural issue. In fact, from now on, expect me to disengage, and when I reappear or when I reemerge, it's going to be in scholastic long form, right? What you realize as a Black intellectual is that as important as that public intellectual life is, it's also a part-time job.
I can't think about the number of times I've been prodded to respond to something that Kanye West has done or said as if I'm like his personal therapist, right? And the fact is we can't respond to it. And we're actually, because the process has been so democratized now, there's so many other folks who are out there who are doing great work. If Brittany Cooper is going to write about something, if a David Leonard's going to write about something, I don't need to write about it.
That's what I'm saying. I mean, I just forward her blog or her op-ed, because I'm like, look, the sister is laying it down. There's not much I could contribute, and in fact, it's exciting for me to see this next generation when you have folks like Brittany Cooper who's putting it down. You don't feel like you have to carry the weight of that next generation in that kind of way. But also the other thing is that you're learning. Like there's perspective that she's bringing to the table. Eric Pritchard is another one. There's perspective that she's bringing to the table that are insightful for me, right? That challenges my own kind of scholastic trajectory, how I'm thinking about these kinds of issues as well. And I remember we were having a conversation a couple months back, and you were talking about working with some of the younger scholars, and you had made a comment like, look, I want to stay relevant, right? So I need to make sure that I am connected to that next generation, so they simply will see and think about these issues in ways that I may have become very conservative about thinking and very kind of set in my ways. And so I need to continue to be elastic and expansive in that way. And I thought, gosh, man, later on I thought, wow, that's absolutely right. That's absolutely right.
Because I know for myself, fundamentally, I think very differently as what I was as a 31-year-old,
right?
As I think of as a 48-year-old, right? And embedded all in that is the kind of hunger to have a certain kind of success in your career, and you're just in a different kind of headspace. And Joan Morgan often jokes about the fact that we find ourselves having the same conversations 20 years later, that we had 20 years ago. But there's so many young scholars now out there who need to have those public conversations with themselves and their peers. And our jobs in part is to encourage them to do that work, make sure that we provide forums for them to do that work, and when things get a little hectic, to have their back, when they're doing this kind of work.
Things will get a little hectic, and I think what happens oftentimes is that, I mean, I won't name the scholar, but there was a junior scholar that was posting something on her Facebook recently about, her apprehensions about jogging in a neighborhood, in an upscale neighborhood, and how that's going to be perceived. And a senior scholar weighed in and started trolling and attacking this woman's critical perspective. And I thought, my goodness, what in the world is it coming to where you have some high-powered caliber scholar who's acting like one of these paternalistic, let's call it what it is, paternalistic, elitist white boys who are coming in and gatekeeping. And so I jumped into the conversation. It was so interesting that the moment I jumped in the conversation, it was like, oh, okay, I can't act out anymore because actually I'm being surveilled in ways that I didn't realize I was, and then there was some pushback. And so to your point, it becomes very important for those of us who are engaged in these issues to be able not only to continue to be on the front lines and helping to mold the critical discourse, but also recognize our role as advocates, recognize our roles as mentors, recognize our roles as, as protectors of these kind of younger folks, many of whom are sticking their necks out, right, to say some of the things that they're saying. And it does matter that a Mark Anthony Neal, that a Jelani Cobb, that a Tracy Sharpley Whiting or something backs a younger scholar up. It does matter.
We've been joined today by Professor David H. Ikard, professor in the Department of English at the University of Miami, author of several books, including Nation of Cowards, Black Activism in Barack Obama's Post-Racial America, and it just recently published Blinded by the Whites, Why Race Still Matters in 21st Century America, both published by Indiana University Press. Thanks for joining us today, David.
Thanks for having me, Mark.
Black lights and Bruce burn when I record for Watts, and every black like Troy Davis who never had a fair shot. All black everything black, culture over everything, y'all. We taking it back.